Welcome. Welcome to the Wigtown Festival and this wonderful session that I'm going to have with one of the world's great lawyers. Philippe Sands is an international lawyer, an expert in international law, particularly human rights law. He is an academic, a professor of law at the University College of London. He is a jurist of great distinction. He's a barrister and Queen's Counsel. He's done many very significant cases in his really wonderful career. And he really stands out as, I think, one of the great communicators about law in our world. And he's written a whole set of books, and a number of them have really been very important for me because his writings on torture, on the whole aftermath of the Iraq War, on so many subjects that he stands out as an iconic figure in the legal firmament. I'm also very lucky because I count him as a friend. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome him here tonight to the Wigtown Literary Festival too. But let me just tell you, it's heartbreaking for us because we had this plan that we were going to be in Scotland together and that we were going to be up there in Wigtown and that we were going to really have a very special time together. And so it's our great disappointment because everybody we know tells us how fantastic this festival is and how it's one of the great things to do. So we will come and do it sort of in the flesh sometime soon, we hope. But tonight we're here doing it virtually. And I want to say it's my great pleasure to be here with Philippe Sands. And we're here talking tonight about his latest book. And as I said, he's written extensively as a really great lawyer and also really for law, making law accessible for everybody, and written about very important subjects that have been, absolutely about headline issues in our contemporary world. He wrote a book which was a great prize-winning book called East-West Street, and many of you will know it won the Samuel Johnson Prize. I think it was still then called the Samuel Johnson Prize. It's now evolved into a different prize. He won, but he won many accolades for that book, which was really dealing with the origins of human rights law in its contemporary form. The laws that were used at the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War, the law of genocide and so on. And Philippe just now is involved in one of the current genocide cases, and they're very rare things, but involving the Rohingya. He's acting for Gambia, taking a case against Myanmar, Burma, for the horrible atrocities that have taken place in the genocide of the Rohingya. But he makes that book so wonderful because he tells it as a story, which is a human story, where he goes in pursuit of his own family's history, finds the histories of the great authors of contemporary human rights law, Raphael Lemkin and Lauterpacht, and then he goes on to make it so human about the horror of what war does, but how law is about trying to deal with the aftermath and the outcomes of that and trying to secure justice. And then he's written this fantastic book, which kind of was born out of that, and it's called Ratline. Philippe, I love this book, and I want to say welcome to you.
Thank you, Helena. It's always brilliant to be with you. I wish we were together in Scotland, your country. I wish we were together in Wigtown. You're, I think, in London. I'm in a little village in France, but somehow we're together, and our spirits are in Scotland. And you, of course, have been a real role model for me. So fire away. Let's go.
Well, listen, you know that I read every word that you produce, and I loved this book. I had to, I mean, of course, we're all isolated, and so perhaps we're reading more greedily than ever before. And I must say that this was for me the book of the last few months. That really I found intoxicating. And it's not just because I'm a lawyer, and I want to say to everybody who's watching tonight, this is not about, this is written in a way that is so fabulous. It's almost like reading a thriller because in your wonderful way. You write very forensically. And here you are, you're making a case. For me, it's about building a case in the way that we as lawyers have to build a case evidentially. And either whether you're defending or whether you're prosecuting or whatever, you build a case and you try to find evidence that really is worthy of its name, that stands up to scrutiny and that would stand up to cross-examination, and you try to build the case so that it would reach a fairly strong conclusion. And you do that in the book, and you take us on a journey. And you build the case. And I'd like you to tell us about how you got on to the whole business of writing the Ratline, which is actually about a particular man and his involvement in crimes against humanity and the horrible crimes of the Second World War, Otto Wächter. But you came to Otto Wächter really in the kind of after period when you wrote your book about your own family, and how your grandfather had come from Lemberg, and how that part of the world was a place in which terrible crimes took place. So please just give the background as to how this book came into existence.
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the central characters is Otto Wächter, but another, of course, is his dear wife, Charlotte, who for me, in many respects, is the beating heart of the book, and we'll say more about that. And they produced a number of children. The fourth child is Horst, who I met in 2012. I met him in strange circumstances. I was beginning to write East-West Street. One of the characters in East-West Street was a man called Hans Frank, who had been Adolf Hitler's lawyer. And in the course of my research, I came across Otto Wächter, who was Hans Frank's deputy in occupied Poland. And there is here a very personal family collection, because Otto Wächter was first governor of occupied Poland, of Krakow, from 1939 to 1942, where he built the infamous ghetto. Many of the people watching this will have seen the film Schindler's List. He's in it. He built that ghetto. And then in 42, he moves to Lemberg, in Galicia, in what is now the Ukraine, Lviv, and he does the same thing. He oversees the extermination of 500,000 people, including my grandfather's entire family. So the Wächters, we could say, have a particular role in my life, but especially my grandfather's life. So Nicholas Frank says to me, Philippe, you're interested in Lemberg. Would you like to meet the son of the governor, Otto Wächter? And I said, well, yeah, well, I'm not sure why he'd want to meet me, but let's give it a go. A few weeks passed, and one thing led to another, and very soon I found myself in this extraordinary 15th century castle in northern Austria, occupied by Horst, aged 75, and his wife, Jacqueline, living in a, I wouldn't say a particularly happy marriage, but alone, impecunious, in a 100-room castle. Very, very strange. Nicholas Frank, you'll remember from East-West Street, absolutely despises his father. Famously, the first day I met him, he said to me, Philippe, you have to understand, I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except the case of my father. He deserved to die. He deserved to be hanged. When he introduced me to Horst, he said, you'll see, you will like Horst, but he's different from me. He loves his father, and he tries to find the good in his father, who did the same things as my father. And so I met Horst, and I encountered a remarkable character. Not a Nazi, not an apologist, but a man looking for the good in his father, Otto. Not, I think it transpires, because he particularly loved his father, but because he loved his mother, and his mother was desperately in love with her husband. I mean, even 40 years after his death. And so I encountered a story which eventually led, I won't give everything away now, to a situation in which Horst gave me the entire family archive of his parents. And every letter, every diary, every photograph, I mean, just absolutely extraordinary. And the USB containing the digitized materials arrived in my desk in the spring of 2015. And we had a dinner party with a very dear friend of yours, actually, who came for dinner, Lisa Jardine, wonderful Lisa Jardine, who's really the the true parent of this project. She said to me, "You working on anything interesting?" And I said, "Well, I've just had this USB come in, 10,000 pages, the private life of a top table Nazi couple." And she said, "Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. We don't know about that. We don't know about the wives and what role they played. Why don't we start a research project without research assistants at the university? Let's decipher the letters. Let's see what really happened in their story." And of course, it was fascinating because unlike Hans Frank, Otto Wächter, after he'd done all his dastardly things, escapes. On the 9th of May 1945, VE Day in Europe, he escapes. And it turns out, I learn and write about in the book, he fled to the mountains, helped by Charlotta, and then eventually in 49 hopes to go to South America on something called the Ratline, ends up in Rome, helped by a man in the Vatican, and there we have the nub of a story. So you couldn't invent it.
No, you couldn't invent it. I mean, I can't begin to tell all of you who are listening how interesting this book is. Partly because, Philippe, if I may say so, you do write brilliantly and you capture personalities and characters wonderfully, and you use the evidence that was in that great archive, if you like, that you managed to put together, to sift and to, I mean, it's what as lawyers we have to end up doing. You're given often mountains of paper and you have to go through it in order to find the kernels that will build up the argument that you're wanting to make. But it was all there. But also,
well, actually, Helena, it wasn't quite all there because I worked out pretty soon, as we would say, they'd filleted the evidence. And someone had been through the material, weeding out all the most horrible bits, but they hadn't done it perfectly. And that was the joy. You could find the kernels of horror that they'd left.
I also love that you are actually a great detective, because you also went off and did all those things of going to people who have expertise in different forensic things like forensic science and toxicology and this and that, in order to kind of really explore aspects of this case. But at the heart of it, as you say, there is. For me, it was very interesting because, of course, Lisa, I didn't know the extent to which Lisa had been involved in this until I read your acknowledgements and your attribution to her. But Lisa, of course, was in saying that she was interested about, we don't talk about the Nazi wives, was for me, what was so interesting here was that this wife was no little wife. She was a I mean, she was an educated woman. When I say that, she spent time in England. She was considered a very cultured wife. She was prepared for a great marriage, and I love this business that she kept a sort of journal, which she was taught to do by her, the previous generation. This is what a lady did, and that you created a sort of history for the family domestically about the different events, the small and the large, and so on, and the kind of dinner parties and what you had, and so that way of keeping a tally on what was going on was rather interesting, because it was a contribution that helped you kind of sense the nature of this. But there was no doubt that I felt that the passion in this marriage came from her. She absolutely adored him. She could kind of, and that the fragile thing of her, even when they were sort of first in the throes of the romance, the feeling that he wasn't committing to her, that she almost would get, and then he would sort of drift away again. He had a commitment phobia, and her desire for him, and that wanting that was definitely all the way there, and the way that she would do anything for him, even the business of when he goes on the run, that she goes and secretly meets him and she feeds him and she brings him things and cares for him and she will be there.
It's unbelievable. I mean, it's unbelievable.
I know.
But also, how did you react? I'm very curious because, of course, you are the person par excellence who knows about the story of the role of women who are subjugated in the legal order. This is a woman who, for the first, as I see it, the marriage is in 2 acts. Act 1 is the first 15 years, when he's basically, it's not an abusive relationship, perhaps in certainly not in a physical sense, but perhaps in an emotional sense. And then when he goes on the run, everything changes. It turns on a sixpence. All of a sudden, she goes from a position of weakness to a position of absolute power, and he needs her to survive. His life is in her hands. And I often wonder whether when he's hanging out on the mountains, basically entirely dependent on his wife, who literally every 2 weeks will spend a day and a half climbing 3,000 meters to bring him food and shoes and socks and supplies and newspapers and to just keep him alive where the Brits and the Americans are too lazy to go. But do you remember that moment in 1936 when Charlotte is living in Vienna? Otto's living in Berlin. He has fled. He's just killed the Austrian Chancellor 2 years earlier, Dollfuss. He flees to Berlin. He's making his way up the greasy Nazi pole. And she arrives in Berlin in the spring of 36 and discovers that dear Otto is having an affair.
Oh, yeah.
What does she do to punish him? 9 months later, she delivers a child. She's pregnant. She has a child. And she says to him, it's a girl. I'm going to call her Tauta after your mistress. That'll teach you. And you've got to wonder about the relation. How did you interpret that? What was your reaction to that?
Well, it was a kind of Diana thing. There are three peoples in this marriage, and I'm not going to let you forget it. You caused me this pain. You did this to me even when I was, bearing your child. I am not going to let you forget the cruelty that you inflicted on me. But somehow to burden a child with the weight of that seemed to me so unfair.
She had a lifelong terrible relationship with that daughter, according to Horst.
Yeah.
And the daughter fled.
There was a sort of steeliness about Charlotte because she loved him desperately, but there was something in her too where she wasn't going to let him think that, he could trample all over her. There was still something there, which meant that she was going to let him know. And that, I think, somehow kept the whole thing alive too, that he wanted her and wanted that devotion from her. He needed that too. But there is a sense that he had an affair with somebody even in northern Italy when he was on the run.
Yeah.
And so on. He was a libidinous man. He was somebody who was always wanting to have sexual relationships. And I'm sure that all the time that he was, during the periods when he was living separately from her, doing his horrible Nazi work, then he was having affairs with people. But she was absolutely intoxicated by him. She really was. And right until the end, and of course she was preserving his, she had to preserve him for posterity, that she wouldn't let him be destroyed in the aftermath, reputationally, although that this indictment was there, existing. Somehow the children were brought up to believe that their father was a good man, and he was only doing what a proper soldier does, and he was obeying orders. That she's a fantastic character. If there was a movie, then she is an amazing, amazing character.
Absolutely. So he dies finally in mysterious circumstances in 1949. And she spends the rest of her life until 1985 devoted to preserving and enhancing his memory. That is what she does for the rest of his life. You literally could not invent what she does. And so the children are presented with this account of their father, this magnificent human being who only did good. And I have to say, this story reaches me since the book came out in the most entertaining ways. So he dies in 49. She's living in Salzburg. I write a little bit about this in the book. And in the mid-1950s, she starts a German language school in Salzburg called Haus Wartenberg. Interestingly, the pupils are not aware that she has reburied her husband in the garden of the language school. But I have received about 24 letters since the book came out from former pupils of hers. They all called her Tante Lotte or the Baroness. amazed about this lady and her past because they knew nothing about it. So I got one fantastic letter from a retired Major General in the west of England saying that my book was an outrage. He knew the Baroness. He'd been a pupil at her language school. She was an absolutely magnificent lady. And she had assured him as a young man when he was 18, 19, that her husband had been some minor officer in some outpost somewhere in Central Europe. And he wrote this letter to me, not on the basis of the book, but on the basis of a review in a newspaper. And I said, well, I wrote back, I said, well, why don't you read the book? And I think it'll be a bit of an eye-opener when you learn quite how many hundreds of thousands of people the husband was responsible for the death of. So she preserved him in this extraordinary way.
Yeah, but that's one of the things that there are so many good bits in this book. We don't want to have any spoilers, because I mean, was it her husband who was buried in the garden? I mean, the interesting thing of that story, but that story of her, you know, deceiving the authorities, getting hold of the body, traveling across it, you know, the whole of Italy, you know, stealing it basically. I mean, it is just. She was a formidable woman. I mean, there was no doubt about it. This woman
making her son-in-law drive down from Salzburg to Rome to collect a package and not telling him what was in the package. And he was Ruprecht Siemens of the Siemens family, who subsequently came back and only later realized that he had inadvertently and illegally transported the remains of Otto Wächter halfway across Europe.
I mean, some of those aspects of the book are just incredible. But the other thing, of course, you know, that one has always had to sort of, you know, grapple with is the whole business of the complicity of the Vatican, because the person who was there in Rome, who was the receiver of Germans and Austrians who were fleeing the processes of justice, that, you know, where they would have ended up being put on trial for crimes against humanity and gross, you know, crimes. One of the people who had been the head of what would have been the equivalent of the Scottish school or the English school in Rome, where people were trained to be priests or trained to be priests of a higher order. And so he was this guy, Bishop Hudal, wasn't he? Hudal?
Well, I should just explain that we didn't know anything about this story. So Horst gives us the material. And from the moment his father Otto goes on the run in May 45 until the moment he dies in July 49, there are literally hundreds of letters and diary entries, but they are all coded. So they're in German, many of them are handwritten, and no names are mentioned of people he met. And this is what excited Lisa Jardine, because Lisa's, you remember that wonderful lecture we went to, Temptation in the Archives.
I remember, yeah.
Her fascination was how people in history who are behind the scenes, their involvement behind the scenes reveals so much. And she was fascinated about this correspondence while he was on the run. What's in it, she said. Let's uncode what's in the letters. Let's go through it methodically. Let's translate it. Let's work out who these characters are. So it took 4 years with 3 or 4 research assistants, an incredible group of young scholars, her students, my students, extraordinary people. And it was meticulous work. So, for example, we had the diary of Otto Wächter. And on the 29th of April, 1949, when he arrives in Rome, the first person he meets is referred to in the diary only as Excellencia, Excellency. And there's no reference to the name. 3 p.m., 29th of April, Excellencia. And then he writes his first letter back to Charlotta. And in the letter, a couple of days later, 1st, 2nd of May, whatever, he writes, yes, it was wonderful. The religious gentleman met me. So we had the task of identifying. And you can imagine this is a huge and time-consuming exercise, but I'm pretty satisfied that we have identified with absolute 100% accuracy and certainty the identities of the people who helped him. And what we came across, in a sense, really was unexpected for me. You know, you and I are courtroom litigators. We know that anything can happen. You become attuned to surprises. But what I did not know and what I did not realize was that the religious gentleman, Bishop Hudal, very close to Pius XII, a few years earlier, they became a little bit estranged, but Pacelli, who became Pius XII, in fact, made one of the Wächter family friends a bishop, consecrated him. Hudal was a spy for the Americans.
Well, that was one of the incredible things that comes out in this. I mean, who knew that there's? I mean, he was the head of the Anima, and that was the German Austrian college. Yeah. You know, there are these colleges where there's the Scottish college and the English college where people would go to Rome to understand the whole kind of, if you like, constitutional architecture of the Catholic Church. You know, so young men would end up there. And he ran the one for the Germans and the Austrians. Yeah. And he was, you know, like the head of an Oxford college, or and he ran this, but at the same time he was working for the CIA, and but he was also, I mean, he was involved in this, if you like, oiling the wheels of the Ratline of the way in which people could get out and get to places like Argentina, and we know that Eichmann and people went to Argentina, and the plan was that Wächter would have gone on that route, probably on a visa to Syria, and then from Syria to somewhere else, and then the boats, which would have basically, and there was a well-developed line, and this bishop was an enabler, and a very important enabler and fixer to make those things happen. But he was also at the same time working, as you are able to, I mean, explain, as things began unraveling, begin to unravel towards the end, of the interlaying stuff about the, you know, who were involved in this. The Soviets had an interest. The CIA had an interest. There were some people that they were happy to let go for all kinds of reasons of their own. And so,
you remember that chapter in the book when, I mean, so I stumbled across this stuff. I'm not a Cold War expert, and I'm pretty blown away by the idea that the Americans have been cutting deals with Italian fascists and with the Vatican right at the very top and retaining them as spies. I mean, the Pope's chief press spokesman, a cardinal, was an American spy, $50 a month for 4 years. So I thought, I don't know anything about this. I'd better go and talk to someone who does know something about this. So you and I have the very great fortune of living in a neighborhood that includes such characters as John le Carré, aka David Cornwall, aka John le Carré. So, you know, we've been neighbors for years, and I just dropped him a note and said, look, this is really a bit bizarre, but I've stumbled across this Cold War espionage story in Italy and Austria in 1949. Could I come and talk to you about it? Because I don't think I can believe what I'm reading and what I'm discovering. So he said, come over, come for tea, bring some cakes, he said, and send me a few documents in advance so I can prepare myself, which I did. I arrived, and he's a very diligent researcher. And we're sitting there on his sofa in Hampstead, and he says, oh, this is fascinating. I hadn't come across this Wächter character, but I have to tell you, it was personally fascinating for me because he said, I was there in 1949. I said, what? He said, yeah, I was an 18-year-old soldier. I was in the British Army, and it was very, very perplexing. My entire childhood, I'd been told the Nazis were the worst things in the world. And now I find myself in Austria interrogating Nazis. And I said, what, to hunt them, to punish them, to put them on trial? He said, no, to recruit them. It was called persil shine. We would wash them whiter than white. And when we found one that could help us because of his Rolodex, giving us access to who the communists were and who the Soviet infiltrators were, we would basically cleanse his record. We'd throw away the file and we'd bring him over to our side and he'd become our man. And we would milk him for all we could. And that was a real shock, Elena.
Yeah, no, and it was to me too. I mean, and let me tell you, I'm not an innocent. I've done lots of cases involving national security and all kinds of things, but that did come as something of a shock. But I want us to go back to the whole business of this man, of Horst, the son, the difficulty he had, he wanted to carry on his mother's work of preserving his father's this great love and this sense that his father was not a wicked man. There was something about for posterity that he owed it to his family. I have to do it for my parents to say good things, that he would have been betraying them if he had done anything else. And it was so different from the son of
Nicholas,
of Hans Frank, from Nicholas. But I want to ask you about this because I suppose we automatically assume that there should be that he should be feeling guilty. He should feel angry that his father did these things. And of course, none of us know how any of us would behave in horrible circumstances. But I mean, if one found out things about one's father that they were involved in, and you present him with the evidence and he still doesn't want to hear it, he's still, even in the face of evidence, for him it was fake news. He was doing a Trump. It was fake news. He didn't want to hear it. He had difficulty accepting it. And then when you made it so clear, he then eventually all he can feel is that he was only doing it because he was expected to do it. He had to do it. The business where you produce a photograph of him standing alongside a shooting of the 50 Poles, and he's there, and he's in the photograph. He still doesn't want to.
I mean, Horst, the relationship with Horst has been sort of extraordinary and extraordinarily complex. The truth is, I like Horst. I'm able to like him because I don't think he's a Nazi. He gave me all the material because at some point Nicholas said on camera, we made a film together for the BBC, My Nazi Legacy, my relationship with the two of them. And Nicholas said, I think he could be a new Nazi. And I disagreed with that. And I said to Horst, I don't think you're a Nazi. He said, how can I prove it? And I said, well, you could give all these materials to a museum and then scholars can look at it. But he is plainly in a situation of absolute denial. And I've thought long and hard about why that is. At the end of the day, is it so terrible to try to honor your parents, to try to honor your mother and your father? And of course, that gives us pause for thought. How would I feel? How would you feel if your dad had killed or been involved in the killing of 500,000 people unlawfully? Would you carry on loving your dad? Would you hate your dad? Would you adopt Nicholas's path? Would you adopt? I can't imagine what it's like. And so I cut him some slack for that. He has no responsibility for what his father did. He does have a responsibility to be honest about the facts, I think. But there was a moment, you saw the film that we made. There's a moment very early on in the scene where he's describing, this is Horst, is describing his birthday party in April 1945. He is 6 years old. And he describes a day when his world is collapsing. The Nazis are on the way out. The Brits, the American bomber planes are going over. They're winning all over the place. It's over. It's collapsed. The life has collapsed. And at that point, it was a very rare occasion. Horst began to weep in my presence and on the camera. You see it in the film. And I find that very touching because it's helped me to understand that for Horst, essentially, his entire life is about the reconstruction of that moment and constructing the possibility of another outcome. His life collapsed. His father disappeared soon after. His mother spent the rest of her life, and he was very close to his mother, trying to, up the reputation of the father. And there is here a psychological element, which is, I think, very touching. And for those of us, I'm on the other side of the story. Horst's father reaped mayhem, havoc, misery on my grandfather's entire family. The entire family was wiped out. And Horst and I talk about that very openly. And it's a very honest engagement. And we have a different interpretation of the facts. But you're picking up from me a sense of empathy for him. I'm trying to understand what he has gone through. And of course, I've built up connections and relationships now with other members of the family. And I won't give it away now, spoiler alert, his own daughter, who becomes, in many ways, right at the end of the book, the most key figure of all. I know from the letters I've received that a lot of people were very distressed by what happened at the end of the book, very surprised by what happened at the end of the book in relation to his daughter, Horst's daughter. And it was just a constant set of surprises. And what I came to understand, and I think this is true for people around the world, it's not a German thing or a Nazi thing or a Jewish thing or a Polish thing or a Ukrainian thing. It is a universal thing. When you go through a trauma, whether you are perpetrator or victim, the legacy goes on and on and on through the generations. And you're trying to work out what has happened. And it's complex.
It's your book is actually resonating very powerfully with me just now. I'm reading it at a time when discussions are taking place about the legacy of slavery and what has been done, for particularly in the United States, or our own legacy with colonialism, the way in which we don't tell all of the history and don't learn about it. And in your book, I mean, to some extent, the undercurrents are the idea of collective guilt, that Germany embraced its collective guilt. Austria's had a more difficult journey in embracing a guilt that is felt by a nation. And the questions arise then about, can there be collective guilt? Are we expecting too much to think that a whole nation should feel guilty about things that, are we responsible for what a government might do?
Helena, this really resonates with me, absolutely. I mean, the book came out at the very moment that the Black Lives Matter and the scenes in Bristol with the statue came up, and it caused me to reflect, and I wrote a piece about it actually for the New York Review of Books a few weeks later. I went to school where basically I was just told Britain was great. I was never told about slavery. I was never told at school about colonialism. I learned about it much later. One of the big cases that I'm doing right now against the United Kingdom is the Chagos case, a group of islanders from a small place in the Indian Ocean who were forcibly and illegally removed, and they want to go home, and the British government won't let them go home. And of course, they're all black.
They were evicted. I mean, it was terrible.
It's a disgusting story. And we have in Britain never come to terms with the legacy. And I think we are now paying a price for it. Frankly, it is what, in part, it's the hubris of Brexit. It's the issue of independence in Scotland. It's what's happening in Northern Ireland. It's the unraveling because of a failure to engage honestly with the past. And what we're witnessing, I think, right now is the demise and disappearance of a United Kingdom, which is happening because it is right now our misfortune to be in the hands of a group of individuals who don't want to look at that history, who don't want to look at the reality of Northern Ireland, who are willing to play games with Northern Ireland and Ireland in relation to the nirvana of Brexit, of bringing power home again, making Britain great again. They're willing, frankly, to lose Scotland, it seems, for that purpose. That may be a good thing or not good thing, depending on different people's perspectives. But the fact is, this starry-eyed view of Britain in the world, Britain, back to the 1930s, where the sun never set on the empire, it's a load of bollocks. It's just a load of crap. And sorry, my language is getting out of control, but absolutely, we have failed to engage as a country with our true legacy, and we are now paying the price for that.
Well, it raises those questions, which is that, there's a very interesting bit in your book. And things are interesting to people because of our own baggage and perspectives. But, for example, there's a point where you're describing how he actually was responsible for the two of his professors of law ended up in concentration camps, right? And he signed the kind of thing, and they went off to concentration camps. Now, but he was the person who didn't go off to a concentration camp, who was a professor of law at the law school in Vienna at that time for him, because Otto was a lawyer too. Was a man who was a totally anti-internationalist. He was a nationalist who believed in National Socialism. I mean, he obviously was one of those people in at the beginning of Hitler's, kind of dream. And he said there should never be international law. Yeah. And I thought it was so interesting because that kind of the populist governments that are coming into being just now, and there are two contagions going on. I mean, there's the contagion of COVID-19 and there's the contagion of populism in so many places. The authoritarian leader, the leader who is popular, who's going to, it's all simple solutions to very complex problems. It's always three words: get it done, bring it home, jail them all, whatever it is. And those populist leaders do not like international law and international courts. And so we've just had it in this last few weeks, this business of tearing up, being prepared to break international law, break with a treaty that you've only signed within the last year, I know that it offends against your very being, but it offends against any of us as lawyers who believe in the importance of law.
Well, I think there's another story here, and that is very connected with the Wächter story. You've read the book very carefully. You will have picked up that basically Wächter's life can be seen as a series of lines crossed that should not have been crossed. It starts off with a little line. In 1921, he's a student, he's in Vienna, he gets involved in protests, he beats up a few Jews, he's convicted to spend a week in prison, fine. A few years later, he joins the banned Nazi party. Another line crossed, actually the skies don't fall in. A few years after that, he's involved in the killing, literally leads the killing plot, of the Austrian Chancellor. He flees to Berlin. Hey, nothing, the world doesn't collapse. He comes back 4 years later. He's made a state secretary. And as you say, unbelievably, he signs the letters removing his own university professors, his own teachers from their professorships. And they are consigned to Theresienstadt, where they perish. He goes to Krakow. Remember that letter that he writes to Charlotte in December 1939? Marvelous. Here in Krakow, the Vienna Philharmonic has been, all these ministers are coming to celebrate my great work. A little bit of local difficulty. Tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. And it's not a far cry from tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. The first act of German reprisal killing in the Second World War, authorized by Hitler, implemented by Wächter. And the next thing is a ghetto. And the next thing is a concentration camp. And basically, that is why what happened in the United Kingdom 2 weeks ago, for the first time, not only in our lifetimes, Helena, but in British history, a government laid before Parliament a bill which it knew and was intended to break a treaty signed and ratified just a few months earlier. We don't give a toss about international law anymore. If the treaty doesn't suit us, we go. It's another line crossed. And I think, I'm afraid to say, we are on that path. The heavens do not collapse. And it's just a matter of time when the next thing comes along.
I'm losing you, and I don't know whether it's the same for everyone else. You were. I was losing your audio then.
Okay.
Maybe mine is lost. Can people hear? I know. We can hear you, Helena. Can we hear Philippe? Not clearly. I wanted to. I mean, it was kind of staggering. I mean, and that particular phrase about, you know, we'll do it in limited and particular ways. I'd love it. My client said, I only broke the law in limited and particular ways. But what you're describing is the way in which these erosions have to be opposed, and we have to have our voices heard, because it is it's a trajectory, and it's a classic trajectory where you have this kind of populist government, you know, and that's what Nazism was. And I'm not making a comparison. History is always different, but we've always got to be alarmed when the rule of law is being abandoned, and we have to be alarmed when you start having attacks upon judges, attacks upon lawyers, intellectuals, writers, journalists, you know. And I'm dealing just now with around the world. You know, I've got lawyers being arrested in Belarus, and we're having to make interventions. I've got a lawyer who's a woman lawyer in Iran who's on hunger strike, and we're trying to do stuff about getting something done about her, and trying to see if there can't be some appeal made so that she doesn't lose her life. You know, this is a human rights lawyer who was acting for women. Women who wanted their rights. So it's our world isn't in a great state when it comes to these things. Now I'm just looking at the chat to see some questions. Apparently, the connection's not great. We've lost Philippe, but I'm going to just carry on talking to you while we're getting Philippe back online. The book is really interesting because it deals with crimes of a monumental nature. But how do you, first of all, can there be intergenerational guilt? It's one of the things I'm rather interested in at the moment, because can you deal with crimes that are hundreds of years old, or even 100 years old? How can it resonate with people for a sense of responsibility to be created, especially if many of the people in a nation, I mean, let's imagine the United States dealing with slavery, where many of the people would say, I didn't live in this country then. I didn't, I wasn't around then. I wasn't party to that. And it has to be done on an institutional level. It can't be, it seems to me, that you go after individuals. You'd have to somehow deal with that legacy in a way of confronting the history, being more honest and transparent about the history, and also about having a society that deals in a more just and fair way towards the people who suffered particularly in those exploitative times and in dominations and so on, whether it was through colonialism or through the slavery or whatever. I'm so sorry that we've lost our champion and our author, but Ratline for me was one of the great books of this year for me, and I loved it. And it was about the trail of this Nazi fugitive, because he went on the run. I mean, basically, he went on the run. He saw what was happening to other people, and he decided not for him. And his wife helped him and was complicit, and he went off across the mountains, and then made his journey down into and hid there for a while until arrangements could be made. And there's no doubt that Charlotte was his conduit for messages between Austria and Rome. And then he made his way down through Italy to Rome, and then was there awaiting his departure when he mysteriously took ill. And the question was, did he just take ill, or was something done to him? So I strongly recommend this book. I think it is a really magnificent piece of work, and but so brilliantly written. And where is our man? And I want to then just say to you that it's dealing with law And I can't begin to tell you how important I think law is, because if you've got a world that is lawless, then you're in serious trouble. In fact, he wrote a book that had that kind of title. Philippe, over to you.
Back.
I'm glad that you're back.
I'm so sorry. We had a crash. It was very, very peculiar. We've got storms around here, and that does occasionally happen. But I've rebooted, and I'm running again. We were talking about lines being crossed, and I'm sure you've filled in the intervening 5 minutes much better than I could.
No. I haven't. Other than to keep saying how much I've loved this book, because it's brilliantly written. But it is about a fugitive. We've got to remember that it's about a man. A large part of this is about somebody who is escaping justice, who's avoiding being brought to book for his crimes, and about how difficult it is. First of all, that you're dealing with things like collective guilt about not being the person who's got the gun in their hand, but who oversees and signs the warrant and who actually is responsible for these incredible horrors, but who can hide behind the suggestion that it wasn't them. The fact that then there is the intergenerational thing of how far down the line do you go with people having to feel responsible for the things that their forebears did? It's so interesting.
One of the things interests me, and I think in part it's because I'm a courtroom lawyer, is we learn as courtroom lawyers that details really matter. We know that it's often in the tiniest of details that an entire case can turn. And so what I've done with these individuals in the Ratline and in East West Street with the documents is just hunted them down to the most minute detail, because often it is that minute detail that tells a greater truth. And in the end, what I've wanted to do with the Ratline, but also with East West Street, is to tell a big story through an individual family story, because I think that helps us to understand. The biggest question, the unresolved question, is how could a man like Otto Wächter, intelligent, intellectual, trained at one of the finest law schools, how did someone like that get involved in mass murder? How did his wife, a highly articulate, wealthy individual coming from a decent religious family, become an enabler, become complicit? How did these things happen? And I think we can only begin to understand the answers to those questions when we get into the minute detail. And what I've tried to do is track the two stories of their lives, the big public story, the acts of killing in which he was involved, whilst at the same time, she's basking on the side of a hill next to a lake in a beautiful part of Austria, or going to a wonderful concert at Salzburg at the festival, whilst the acts of killing are going on. And it forces us to think about our own lives, how things go on in parallel, how we turn an eye away from the truths because we don't want to see them. And I think we can only understand the answer to the big question by descending into detail, not into theory, not into big picture story, but the minutiae of the life of a couple who lived together for 20 years, from the moment they met until the moment he died, to understand how they did what they did.
That detail also shows that they were actually ideologically committed to this project. Yeah. I mean, it was through the detail that it becomes clear that, I mean, there must have been in amongst those people, people who, almost by other processes, by being in certain families, it was expected that when, wars take place, that you join up and you take part and you look after the fatherland and so forth. And there must have been people who, out of sort of misplaced sort of a sense of duty, took part in things, and then who did take part in horrible events, where if they had time to even think about it, but even if they had time to think about it, might not have been able to extract themselves from it. I mean, there must be people, we know of events where people end up going along with the project, not because they're believers, but because to actually stand out would have brought punishments beyond what they were prepared for. Yeah. And there were also many people, there must have been, in Germany and in Austria, who basically just kept their heads down. And so, you know, I think silence, we do know that silence is complicity. We have a responsibility when we see things happening to somehow have our voices heard. So at least our, you know, it's very interesting. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has just died. And one of the things that I've sort of made a kind of note of was her being asked about being a dissenter, but being somebody who dissented in judgments, even when everybody else was in agreement about something, where she would speak out and write a dissenting judgment, and got the reputation for it. And they asked her about it, and she said, dissent is often the thing that it's for the future. And when she was dissenting and saying, no, I'm not agreeing because I don't think that's because it can be held on to by people who will then take it with them and use it in future argument and so on. And in many ways, we have to dissent when we see things happening that we know are wrong. But these were ideologues. I mean, that's what the piecing together of the detail that you've done, Philippe, shows, was that they believed in this project, actually. They really did. Oh, and totally. She did too.
Totally. And you saw that. I mean, you know, there's the letters I uncovered from August 1942. The final solution is about to be implemented in Lemberg and in Galicia. And Himmler isn't 100% sure of whether he can rely on Wächter. So he travels to Lemberg, I think on the 17th of August, 1942. And there is a minute.
Amazed. These dates are so seared in your memory.
And there's a minute of the meeting. And Himmler writes back to head office in Berlin and said, I spoke to Wächter. I told him he could go back to a desk job in Vienna, or he could stay here and finish what we have started. And he said he wants to stay. So he knew exactly what he was doing. There's no shadow of a doubt. If he had been caught, he was, of course, indicted for mass murder. He would have been convicted of crimes against humanity and genocide, and he would have been hanged like everyone else. Horst does not accept that, but I have not an iota of doubt that that is what would have happened to him, as it happened to his mate, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who is Horst's godfather, as it happened, you know, to Globocnik and to him. They all died because they were all in it up to their necks, and they did it knowingly and willingly.
I've got two questions coming up for you. One is from someone who's really asking about the sins of one's fathers, that most of us, you know, might not know about the terrible things that perhaps lie hidden in our own personal histories, things that were done by you know, previous generations, the contributions that they made to some of the horrors in our world, and this. Anne is asking, you know, if we don't really, does it mean that it becomes part of our genetic being? Is it that we can never really know who we are because we don't know those pieces that are lost, that those pieces of history, of our own personal history, that are buried somewhere? Do you want to say anything about that?
Look, I mean, every individual is different and every family is different. I don't think it's a sort of cookie cutter, one size fits all. And I think we are all touched in different ways by our forebears, by what we know, by what we don't know, by what we turn away from, by what we seek out. But I'd say this, in relation to the Wächter family, it is pretty clear that the 5 children, the 6 children, and the 23 grandchildren paid a very big price for the sins of the father. They are none of them responsible in any way for what Otto Wächter did or for what Charlotte Wächter was complicit in. But the challenge they have is, how do they engage with that history? Horst broke ranks. This is actually rather complicated. there were 6 siblings. He has 5 brothers and sisters. 5 of them didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to know, didn't want to investigate. He decided to investigate, and he decided to talk to me. And because he talked to me, the other members of the family have cut him out.
They're not talking to him.
They're not talking to him anymore. And so I feel, in that sense, I do owe him a debt of gratitude for having opened up. I don't share his interpretations, but at least he has tried. Is that worse, or is it better than the siblings who decided to do nothing? And it carries on into the next generation. I describe in the book, amazingly by coincidence, one of the grandchildren of Otto Wächter married a lady who was my former student at New York University Law School. And she invited me with the grandchild to dinner in Vienna. This was 3 or 4 years ago. And in the course of the dinner, he went off to the men's room at some point. And then my former student, the wife of the grandchild of Otto Wächter, said to me, "Philippe, could I ask you a favor? Could you make sure this book is never published in Austria?" And I said, "Well, I can't really do that, but why do you say that?" And she said, "Because I want to protect our child, because we have managed to cleanse the Wächter name out of history, and it will be better for our child if a spotlight is not shone in our country on the grandfather. That would be better. Thank you, Philippe."
That's very... I mean, I often think about it in relation to someone like Nicholas Mosley. You know, there are some names that are kind of hard to carry, you know, and yet it's about saying, you know, either I'm going to just change my name and use my mother's name or something, or I'm going to say I'm somebody different. But I think it is an interesting thing, and I can understand that some of the family thought, well, you know, we don't want to be back in the headlines. We don't want to be back being talked about again. And I'm sure that was their attitude. And so this business of having to somehow try to get to some form of truth, which Horst had, however diluted it was, seemed to be his avenue. And everyone finds their own way of dealing with those things of the past, but it can often be very divisive in families. Kenny asks, do you think that Trump, you know, are we influenced? Is our government, you know, the Westminster government, influenced by Trump in his disregard for, the idea of the international community?
Thank you, Kenny, for that question. I really appreciate that question. I've done a lot of thinking about this, and I think what's going on now is absolutely tragic. You know, 1945 was exactly 75 years ago. And in fact, on the 20th of November, so just in a few weeks' time, I will travel to Nuremberg. I've been invited to a small event in the courtroom to mark the 75th anniversary of the opening of the trial. And I will be there in conversation with the president of Germany to discuss the legacy of Nuremberg. And one of the things that I think I am likely to say is, who would have imagined that 75 years later, it would be the British and the Americans who were ripping up the legacy that they created, the extraordinary legacy they created in that 1945 moment, a rules-based system under international law. That was a British-American invention, a British-American idea. The UN, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the Nuremberg Charter, the idea of human rights, international criminal laws. This was the British and the Americans driving through this vision, and it is they who have walked away from it. And who could have imagined, back on the 20th of November, 1945, when the trial opened in Nuremberg's courtroom 600, and Hans Frank was there, Wächter was on the run, that 75 years later, we would look to Germany as the flag carrier of liberal democracy and the idea of the rule of law in international relations. I am deeply worried about where things are going in the United States, and deeply worried about where things are going in the United Kingdom. One thing always leads to another. And there is a scenario in which we can imagine that the United States is somehow hurtling to civil war, that Britain is hurtling to dissolution. If either of those scenarios come credibly into view, they will bring dislocations, they will bring bloodshed, and they will bring tremendous difficulty. This is an exceptionally difficult moment. History does not repeat itself, but there are lessons to be learned.
That business of history not repeating itself really sort of chimes with a question from Paul Cromie, and I'm going to really finish with it. We've been given a little bit of extra time because we had lost some time. But Paul Cromie was asking, I mean, do you see echoes with Germany and Italy? Or is that too crude an analogy? Or, there always is a resistance and a reluctance for us to say, this is like the rise of Nazism. I mean, and that's not what you're saying, and certainly not what I'm saying, because I think that different times create different things and different phenomena. But there are some things that are a kind of, if you like, a pattern that should be alarming to us. And I just want to ask you about that Paul Cromie's question, which is, do you think that there's a sort of timeline, a sort of way in which we're seeing things happening, which do replicate things that happened around the 30s?
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. I mean, it's obviously something that now a lot of people are thinking about. I mean, we live in different times, technologies are different, countries are different, people are different. So I don't for a moment think it's identical, but I do think there are lessons to be learned. And one of those lessons, which I've already referred to, is that when lines are crossed, you find yourself in a place in which it becomes permissible to cross other lines. So who would have imagined a few years back that the United States of America would have a government which, when migrants cross illegally into their country, undocumented, children of 1 or 2 will be separated from their parents in ways that cause tremendous grief and difficulty. I wouldn't have thought that imaginable. Who would have thought that the United Kingdom would put itself in the position that it has in relation to Chagos, that is like South Africa in 1971, when South Africa ignored a decision of the International Court of Justice, which said its attempt to occupy a place called Namibia was illegal under international law. Well, Britain's just doing that right now. It's illegally occupying a part of Mauritius, and it's not allowing a group of people known as the Chagosians to go back to their homes from which they were evicted 50 years ago. So if these things continue to happen, if these lines are crossed, eventually you will get someone in power who'll say, we crossed those lines. The skies did not fall in upon us. Let's cross a few more lines. And I think that is the real danger. There is a shredding going on now of the 1945 order. It is led by the 2 countries that created that order. There is a lawlessness in this country and in the United States, and that's deeply worrying.
Well, friends, please take that to our hearts, because there are things that we as citizens can do. And one of the things is that we have to say law matters. There are going to be certainly attacks upon the ways in which judges are appointed to our Supreme Court. There's certainly attacks going to take place in England and Wales on judicial review. It might not happen up and down these aisles, but there are certainly ways in which law is really under assault. And we've got to reckon that with the fact that these are often indicators of really bad things. So I'm sure that you'll take those messages with you. But the message I want to start with tonight is, this is a fabulous book.
Thank you.
The Ratline by Philippe Sands. It is a really, really wonderful book. And it's a book that will stay with you, and it will be reread by you. And so please, I hope that you will take it home with you and download it or buy it and get it into your hands, because you will not regret it. It's a wonderful book. Philippe, I've loved seeing you again. Have a wonderful time in France. I'm deeply jealous.
Back soon, Helena, back soon.
Okay, good.
Into quarantine.
Anyway, and we'll all be back in Wigtown as soon as we possibly
we
can.
We will, absolutely.
Invite us back
next year in Wigtown.
Next year in Wigtown. Thank you.